This afternoon we've got a really amazing session for you. So we start to delve a little bit deeper now into some of the projects that are ongoing, that are being run by the Department for Transport, some in collaboration with CPC as well, that are really kind of making a difference and moving towards decarbonisation. So first I'd like to enjoy welcoming Rob Singleton, Head of Planning from DfT, to talk about what's happening with the connectivity tool. Thanks, Rob.
Cool. Hopefully my mic works and hopefully it's at the right level so that people can hear me. I feel a lot like Steve Jobs. It's upsetting, a cross between that or Britney Spears. But okay, so I'm Rob Singleton. I'm the Head of Planning at the Department for Transport. I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you guys about some of the work that we've done jointly with CPC, but on the evolution of what we call a connectivity tool, which we're hoping is going to solve quite a fundamental issue in the spatial and transport planning spheres. I'm going to talk first a little bit about what our team actually does, just to give you a little bit of context on that, and then I'm going to give you a bit of context on the problem that we're trying to solve, and it aligns really neatly with a lot of the speakers who spoke earlier about some of the challenges that we face both in levelling up terms but also providing the housing and the jobs that people need and where to locate it. So I'll talk a little bit about us. So the planning team in the Department for Transport is a bit of a centre of excellence. We're all sort of chartered town or transport planners. So we have a bit of a broad church of expertise to provide some credible planning advice to our colleagues across all modes and to our arm's length bodies, who obviously deliver some of the most important infrastructure the country needs. We want to foster a step change in how we do things, how we decarbonise our network, and how we use our existing legal and policy frameworks to achieve better outcomes. Ultimately, we're there to sort of effectively seek to deliver sort of what I'd consider a little bit to be the holy grail of sustainable development, and what that means, and how that should be really infrastructure-led and done in a very pragmatic way that better aligns the spatial and transport planning systems. So to give you a little bit of context about what work we've been doing on the connectivity tool and the work that we've been doing with CPC, is that it's really clear to me, and I'm sure to everybody else in this audience, that transport outcomes are intrinsically linked to spatial choices. So where we put transport infrastructure has a marked impact on where we decide to put development, and equally how we interact with our built environment. This is not new stuff. We've been talking about this for ages. Our society is predicated on transport leading and unlocking economic and social growth. And you've got a plethora of different studies from decades to say, actually, you know what, it's really important to think about transport and spatial planning holistically. So think about where you want to get to, what infrastructure you need to put in place, and then build the jobs and growths around it. So the transport delivery is intrinsically linked to things like how much density you can build in development terms, whether that's number of jobs or number of homes. It's intrinsically linked to how we design our public realm. It's really important when we're trying to get people to make different choices about transport that we have a well-designed and appropriately spec'd up public realm that enables people to walk safely and freely. But also what choices we make about the location of development. Should we be making choices in a different way? And how do we empower our local plan makers and decision takers to locate development in areas that are most connected to public transport and sustainable transport modes? I'm a town planner, always have been. I'm going to say that's a lie. I haven't always been, but ultimately, you know, obviously it's in the bones of me. But spatial planning is really about, and it goes back to some of the previous discussions earlier today, about understanding where things should be built and what infrastructure, both social and environmental, needs to be put in place to ensure that that development is sustainable. How that should work in England is we've got a almost two-tier approach. We've got national planning policy through the National Planning Policy Framework that sets out key principles for spatial planning. and a suite of guidance to underpin that, and then that should be interpreted, directly trickled down to local planning authorities, who then interpret those principles and create a spatial plan and specific policies to guide development in areas. And this is done by local authorities in consultation with local people. So it should be a fit-for-purpose, vision-led type plan that delivers on all of the needs that our community reasonably expect of us. And national policy sets quite a clear ambition, which is to obtain sustainable development. So development that doesn't prejudice us both now and future generations, but also to balance that socio-economic and environmental tensions that you sometimes get. But ultimately, sustainable development for me means locating development in the right places, which is the reason for being of the planning system. However, how this often works is in England is that sustainable patterns of development may be extolled in national policy, but it's not necessarily always delivered on the ground. And that tends to be because there's no common definition of what sustainable patterns of development actually means. It's kind of like there's an intuitive sense of what it should be, but how it is delivered on the ground is variable. And that's variable on a number of different issues. Some of it can be that there's an absence of a local plan, or the local plans are outdated, or it could be because there isn't the metrics there to empower local plan makers and decision takers to do things differently, or it can even be things like land availability. Sometimes land isn't in the most sustainable of locations. So how do we try and fix that? How do we try and move it forward? Well, what we've done with CPC is a bit of a discovery phase, understanding of what sort of the problem we wanted to solve, which was putting developments in the wrong locations has substandard outcomes for our communities and for what we want to do to decarbonise our transport network. And we need to get to a point where we can empower our local plan makers and decision takers to take things and do things differently. So when we talk about variable outcomes at a local level, you can see from these stats. So we've done a little bit of a desktop exercise. We looked at 14 local plans that had been adopted in 2022, and we sort of scrutinised them to see whether or not they were taking seriously the national policy aspiration for delivering sustainable patterns of development. And what you can see from this table is, in the vast majority of cases, sustainable locations are discussed. Sustainable transport is discussed. Transport policy with sustainable transport considerations are discussed, and that sustainable transport improvements should be proposed for new site allocations, and that this should reference a local transport plan. But ultimately, and as you can see, you know, that's quite high percentages, the evidence requirement for what a sustainable location actually is never actually articulated. So you end up with substandard outcomes. And equally, because the spatial planning system and the transport planning system are often structurally located in different organisations, so often the transport authority is at a county level and the planning authority is at a district level, that interface between the importance of delivering transport infrastructure and its link to ensuring that we're delivering sustainable development in the right locations is kind of absent. There's a gap. And you can see the starkness of that gap. So sustainable locations are discussed and there's a clear vision, but that evidence requirement is just not there. So how are developers, how are decision takers supposed to assess the relevant merits of site allocations and plan applications? And this all has carbon implications, but what's important about this particular slide is this is taken from the Central Links, Lincolnshire's local plan, and it's bioregional carbon evidence. And basically you've got two sets of graphs. On the left-hand side, you've got a pre-local plan expression of carbon emissions as a result of different type of geographies across the Central Links area. And then on the right hand side you've got the carbon emissions as a result of the policies in that local plan being implemented. And what you can see is almost universally in anything that's blue and yellow you can see reductions, particularly with yellow it completely goes, and that's about building energy use, operational use from buildings. But what you can see from a transport perspective is there's broadly speaking, absolutely no change. And that basically means that they're not, their policies are not in a place where they're seeking to decarbonise transport, but also they're not securing better outcomes in sustainable transport modes. That means it's really difficult, therefore, for local authorities to deliver on government policy, because we've talked a lot today about leadership and the need for leadership. Well, having strong government policy is one thing, but operationalising how you implement it on the ground is a completely different one. And there is no agreed mechanism by which you can understand how connected a place is, i.e. where should you put that development, because it's already connected to the destinations we want to get to by sustainable transport modes that we need to use to improve user choice at a local level, decarbonise our network and build to higher densities. That means it's not often easy to understand the connectivity impacts of investment decisions. So when we're trying to plan for new transport investment decisions, not being able to understand connectivity is a critical issue. And this is why DfT have decided, actually, you know what, it's really important to start empowering local plan makers and decision takers to do things differently and have a UK model of connectivity, which effectively is an expression of how sustainable a location is and how suitable that location is for development, based on not only how accessible it is to public transport, walking and cycling, but importantly, how accessible or connected it is to the destinations you need to go. How easy is it for our residents and our communities to get to their jobs, get to leisure, get to shopping? But this is not, again, rocket science. This is a proven approach. In London, since the London Plan and the advent of public transport accessibility levels, what you've found is that in creating a metric, which was public transport accessibility level, and embedding it within a policy framework, which was the local plan, you've seen a transformative impact in the way local transport and spatial plan makers have approached development in their area. Particularly in suburban areas, it's been transformational. And the basic premise was, the more accessible a particular location is to public transport, the more capable it is of accommodating growth. So you could build at higher densities, you could make more efficient use of land, and you could effectively manage that use of land in a more appropriate way. And what it done at particularly a suburban level was empowered decision takers to do things differently, whether they liked it or not, because it was embedded in a policy framework which set minimum expectations for density, for employment numbers, car parking levels, etc., etc., etc. And that picture of Woolwich Arsenal would not have ever come to bear 20 years ago without public transport accessibility level and how it was embedded in a local plan. And from my own experience, when I was working in Enfield, I was lucky enough to work at Enfield before the London Plan came into being and then after. And to see the effect PTAL had on decision taking was actually quite astounding. And this is it. This is PTAL. It's a heat map. It effectively expresses in colours how accessible that location is. That's Woolwich Arsenal. That development would not have been built to that density without it. And ultimately, it's an easily understandable and consistent metric that you can apply. So how can we learn from the experiences of London and apply that at a national level? So we had a few hypotheses about what sustainable locations meant and how we could work with the CPC to sort of develop this. Our first hypothesis was that data on connectivity could improve spatial or transport policies and decisions at national and local level, that data on transport access to different land uses is inconsistent and leads to variable outcomes, but that also data-led approaches can support the better alignment of spatial and transport planning. Again, just to emphasise, structurally, spatial and transport planning sit in very different churches. Even at a central government level, DLUC deal with spatial planning, DfT deal with transport planning. How do we bridge that gap so that we are delivering infrastructure that can unlock and catalyse growth? So that's when we came up with the connectivity tool. And working with colleagues in CPC, we done a prototyping exercise for what we called a amenity accessibility index, ostensibly exactly the same as the connectivity tool that we have since developed internally at DfT. And basically a connectivity metric measures someone's ability to get to where they want to go. Public transport accessibility level is very agnostic to destination. It doesn't care where you go, it just cares how frequent your services are. Connectivity is about where you want to go to further articulate what a sustainable location is. And a sustainable location should be, you put development in an area where you can get to where you want to go easily by a variety of transport modes. It accounts for different destinations and different modes of travel, and it also takes an account of travel time. It's an index measure, so it shows relative connectivity, a bit like PTAL does, relative accessibility. And through analysing where people want to go, either shopping, visiting people, to work, education, entertainment, health, and by which mode, public transport, cycling and walking, you get a connectivity score. And the closer to 100 it is, the more connected the place is, and that, from a policy making point of view, is where you should stick a load of development. And the lower the score is, the worse connected it is, which means that not that you don't necessarily build there, but you understand the infrastructure you need to make that area more connected. So do you need to deliver schools? Do you need to deliver better bus routes? So just to give a bit of an overview why I think connectivity is better than PTAL, is because PTAL, or access to a network, only looks agnostically about its access. So it's frequency of service, how quick that service is, and where spatially your nearest stops are. Connectivity, however, talks about all of that, but equally how those bus routes go to the locations that you would want to go. So what is your willingness to travel? Why would you want to be there? How those connections can be made quickly, and what are the most often used destinations, for example, schools. And that relates better to the journey needs of the real world transport user. Just to give another sort of flavour as to why connectivity is a better metric of the sustainability of a particular location, is that if you look at these two scenarios, they're basically the same. You've got two housing developments, both with a bus service that has 10-minute frequency and a 30-minute journey time. The only difference between the two scenarios is where you can get to. In the top, you get to, say, an urban centre with all of the wonderful things that are in urban centres, and at the bottom you get to a field or a campsite or something that you might not necessarily want to go on a frequent basis. Now, in accessibility terms, both of those would measure exactly the same. However, in connectivity terms, because of the value of the destination, you have a much higher score for those with destinations than you would do with no destination at all. And I think one of the things to be really, really clear about is not only have we learnt from PTAL that there is value and merit in doing this type of metric to empower local plan makers and decision takers to do things differently. Other people have recognised it. And again, with the work of CPC, we've done a bit of a horizon scan of all of the metrics that are out there. And obviously I've talked about PTAL, but there's GMAL, which is Greater Manchester's accessibility level. And then you've got Bristol, which is Bristol's metric of accessibility level. And what that shows me is that there is value in the approach. People have learnt from London. They do understand that there's stuff that we need to do. We do understand that we need to put development in locations that are the most sustainable and previously developed. And they should be located around our transport hubs. And if we take some universal truths, which is land is finite, we have a housing crisis, we want to level up our economy, the simple question is, where do you put the development? Not if you put the development, because if you agree with all of those prepositions, then the solution can only be something like this. But what is really important, and when we go back to that point about variable outcomes, is where you have variable metrics, you're only ever going to get variable outcomes. And equally, that takes a lot of resource and energy on behalf of those local authorities to do their own bespoke tool. So why shouldn't we do something at a national level? And that's where the connectivity tool really comes in. So the connectivity tool, I would love to have done a demo because it is awesome. but I can't because technology won't allow me. But the connectivity tool has two principal functions. The first is analytical and the second is propositional. In an analytical term, it basically allows users to view the overall connectivity score of a 100 by 100 metre square anywhere in England and Wales, and it gives you that value and that score. It also breaks that down by mode and destination and a combination of those, but it also allows, if you have a look at that bottom left-hand side, it allows users to view the routes that contribute the most to the connectivity score of the area. So where you see those amber lines, they're bus routes to particular areas. Where you see those black lines, they're walking and cycling routes to particular areas, and where you see those little circles, those are the destinations that you'd want to go to. So we've mapped out spatially employment areas, schools, etc., etc., etc. Now that's brilliant, that's great from a policy perspective and how you plan for development in your area and how you make decisions on planning applications, but it also has a propositional function, and a propositional function is quite revolutionary in and of itself, which is it also allows you to plan new transport interventions and then make a calculation around what that does to the connectivity of an area. So say for the sake of argument, again, we agree that development doesn't always go in the right place. It can be built at quite low densities in the middle of a field in the middle of nowhere. That's going to be an inevitability because land availability is not always there in urban centres and it might have a significant value to it. But this propositional element allows local authorities and developers to think about the infrastructure you need to put in place to support that development and how that then affects the connectivity of that area, i.e. making it more sustainable. So in methodology, I ain't no data scientist, so bear with, and if you do have questions about it, don't ask me. I'll take it away and come back to you. But how do we do it? Well, we find all destinations by type and they're broken down into subcategories. So we take education, for example. You've got primary, secondary, special schools, universities, colleges, etc. For every given location in England and Wales, we've gridded it up into a 100 by 100 metre square. We calculate how long it takes to get to these destinations, and it finds, through very cleverness, the shortest route between origin and destination using public transport timetables, average cycling speeds, average walking speeds, and it does do it by car, FYI, but you can deselect it or select it as you wish. It also takes account of typical driving speeds on a particular road, including where present data on congestion. It's not real live data, it's from a fixed point in time. Then it adds up those scores to create a metric for each subcategory. So you have diminishing returns because you can't value everything equally, and equally you can't anticipate exactly where people want to go at any given point. But if we take education again, it will count the nearest school, whatever school that is, fully, and then the second less and the third less. We only consider journeys under an hour because that's about people's willingness to travel by public transport, walking and cycling. It's weighted by people's willingness to travel, given the distance on the specified mode, and that comes from data from the National Travel Survey, and it's calculated for all times of the day, added and weighted on the basis of frequency of travel at that time. You add all of that together, stick it into something that does something like 1 trillion calculations, and you get a connectivity score. And that's what it looks like, the connectivity tool, when you go on its landing page. It's the whole of England. You can tell the dark areas, particularly in Wales, not particularly connected. The red areas around London, very connected. But you've also got flexibility in scoring. So it's not just about a single point of truth, which is incredibly important, I might add, from a policy making point of view. You need to give value to the number. So you can't have a constantly changing number. There needs to be one single point of truth to make policy on it, so like density. But you can interrogate the connectivity scores. You can print reports to show how it's made, but you can also toggle about with the different transport mode, the different destinations. So if you're an education provider, you can just look at schools accessible by walking and cycling, for example. And yeah, you can effectively, again, to empower local decision makers to do things a bit differently, you can really interrogate that and use this as a bit of an evidence base to justify your policy and decisions. So We've been developing this tool for probably about 18 months there or thereabouts. Part of it with the discovery phase with CPC, brilliant work, I might add. But we're now at a stage where we've just done our first alpha test. We're into our beta testing phase. And effectively what we're trying to do is test the flex and the usefulness of this tool with local planning authorities and transport authorities to really mess about with it to the extent where it becomes something that's useful and viable. So we're using a range of use cases. Do our assumptions about the tool work? Would it achieve the outcomes that we want to do? How easy is it to use? What are the efficiency impacts if we do use a tool like this? What does it save in time and money? The one thing I will say is that through beta testing, it's all still in development. It's still in beta testing phase, so it's not really something that people can use in a real world scenario. But we're really interested in understanding how this can help local authorities to assure, speed up and make more robust their ongoing work streams, because this should work for them. If we're going to do this, it needs to have the right outcomes and do the right things. And we'd like to pilot it with the broadest range of possible use cases. So if memory serves, we've got about 22 local authorities there or thereabouts on our books at the present moment in time. But ultimately, you can see that there's a range of applications for this. I'm not going to go through this because I think I've not got that long, although I'm not too sure.
3 minutes.
3 minutes? Oh my God, I'll go for it then. So from a plan and policy making point of view, if you're a local transport authority, a subnational transport body or combined authority, you'll be developing a local transport plan. You can see applications in local transport plan making as a result of using this tool. If you're a local authority developing spatial options like your site allocations and you're appraising those sites, this tool could have some value. If you're creating a master plan or an area-specific plan, particularly, say, a garden community, you can play about with the propositional functions to see what transport interventions are needed to make it more sustainable. If you're a combined or unitary authority developing a strategic spatial development plan, again, you can see how you can embed it in policies. So if connectivity tool says X, Y should be applied in policy terms. So that could be density, that could be any number of different things. It could help local authorities working on infrastructure delivery strategies. Definitely look at that in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. Quite excited about that provision because that imposes a legal requirement to consider infrastructure in the deliverability of local plans. That's actually a bit of a step change. Local authorities planning for health and education. Like I say, one of the things that I really like about the tool is it does two things. It shows you where things are really good, but also shows you where things are really bad. And in showing you where things are really bad, and I'm putting bad in inverted commas, because everyone loves where they live. Well, some people might not. Is identifying deficiency can also help you plan for what you need to put. So the lack of something means you might need to put a school there, for example. A statutory consultee, so National Highways commenting on local plan proposals, this could work with. Planning inspectors during local planning examination and local authorities developing design codes. Because if I take you back right to the beginning of my presentation, design quality is key in empowering people to make different choices in how they travel. But in decision takings, when you're getting a planning application, a developer could analyse different interventions needed to support a site. Local highways authorities can figure out what infrastructure deficiencies or efficiencies there are as a result of development coming forward. Because it's infrastructure-led, local authorities could potentially use the tool to negotiate developer contributions. Same for a local transport authority. It will help in local transport plans to allocate funding for those transport interventions that give you the most bang for your buck, i.e. unlocks the most growth potential. And then ultimately, development management, which is where I come from effectively, assessing the suitability of the site. So rough timeline in terms of getting this to what we're going to call a public beta test is we're doing user tests as we speak. We're doing pilots with local authorities, transport authorities, subnational transport bodies, and a load of professional bodies, and that will be between March and August. And then we're going to get some feedback in August to September to help with that development of the front end of the tool. We're hoping, obviously, dependent on ministerial clearance as much as anything else, and whether or not this is valuable. Might not be valuable. that we would launch the tool for public beta probably N24, beginning 25. But here's a watch this space. I would have loved to have done a demo of the tool, but I can't. But if you're really interested in seeing what it looks like, myself and my colleague Marco will be sat on a table in one of the break sessions where you can come along and we'll fiddle about on our laptops and show you how shiny this tool actually is. But hopefully that's helped. I think I'm done.
Brilliant. Thank you.